but it's my pleasure to be here on behalf of Tech UK to chair what is going to be a fascinating discussion on a key topic of the day, building trust in digital identity. We've seen debates and the conversation around digital identity come to the fore during the COVID pandemic and crisis. But we've been talking about digital identity and the role digital identity could play in our digital economy and digital society for some time. But important questions are now being raised about how we move forward with digital identity and the UK's digital identity infrastructure. At Tech UK, we see this and digital identity as a key missing link in the UK's digital economy and society, and a key enabling technology for what comes next. And we actually published recently a white paper, Digital Identity is the Missing Link, which was published in August and you can find on the Tech UK website. But this month in September, we've seen the government release its long-awaited response to the call for evidence, seeking views on the future of digital identity policy across the UK. And I think we're going to be talking about what that response talked about and what we do next. Now we have that response with our panel, particularly including some of the key principles that the response included, the role of a digital identity strategy board, and the importance of getting privacy, transparency, inclusivity, interoperability, and many other of the principles right. But COVID and the coronavirus has also perhaps changed the conversation in the UK around digital identity and raised questions that we also need to think about as we move forward and how we get this right for everybody. What more needs to be done to accelerate the establishment of a secure, efficient digital identity economy in the UK that brings everybody with us and engenders trust and confidence in this key technology. So that's some of the issues we're going to explore today with our amazing panel. And we have some great panelists for you to listen to. I am simply going to be chairing this one. We've got a wonderful panel of experts from industry and from academia to really get into the devil of this detail. And we've got the time to do it today, which is a real treat. So I'm going to ask each of them just to introduce themselves, say who they are, where they've come from. And then when we've done introductions, we'll kick off with some opening remarks from each of you in terms of why you're here, why you think this topic is really important. And then we'll go on into the discussion from then. So perhaps Julie, do you just want to introduce yourself to everybody, say who you are, where you come from, and then we'll move on to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue. Delighted to. My name is Julie Dawson, and I lead for Yoti, Digital Identity Platform, on our ethics and on our government relations. So really looking at the ethical framework development for Yoti on the human rights front, and also looking at the technical accreditations that we need going forwards. Yoti is a digital ID and credential management platform, and we let organizations verify identities and trusted credentials both online and in person. And we let any individual prove who they are or how old they are, face-to-face or online. So we span identity verification, but also age, looking at e-signing, access, that could be online or in person, and authentication. So working with over 8 million people globally who've set up with Yoti, and in the UK, over 1.5 million. So delighted to be here. Thank you, Sue.
Oh, great to have you with us. Michael, great to see you as always. Just introduce yourself to everybody.
Hi, Sue. I'm Michael Veale. I'm a lecturer at University College London in the Faculty of Laws. I'm a lecturer in digital rights and regulation. I think possibly one of the reasons why I'm here is during the corona crisis, I was also one of the co-developers of a system called DP3T, which was later adapted by Apple and Google to create the exposure notification framework for contact tracing. And contact tracing, of course, has created some interesting questions of digital identity and spurred some debate. So happy to be here. Thanks a lot, Sue.
Great to have you with us. Thank you, Michael. Bryn, over to you.
Thanks, Sue. It's really great to be here today alongside some real expertise in the world of digital identity. So it's really great to be included. My name's Bryn Robinson-Morgan. I work for Mastercard. I work in our digital identity team, our service which is called ID. My background is in digital identity and identity more broadly. So I know that today we're talking about the government's response to the digital identity consultation. I've been involved with the UK's digital identity scheme, gov.uk Verify, So I was product owner for 2 of the providers under that scheme, and looking forward to how we can actually get digital identity implemented and bring it up to scale.
Great, Bryn. I'm sure we'll get onto that very soon. Edgar, brilliant to have you with us also. Do you just want to perhaps introduce yourself and your role and your experience?
Yep, so I'm Edgar Whitley. I'm an academic at the London School of Economics. I've been studying digital identity systems for, gosh, over 15 years. I was the research coordinator for the LSE Identity Project when the Blair government, remember him a few prime ministers ago, was introducing the idea of biometric ID cards for a centralized digital biometric-based digital identity system. Since 2010-ish, I've been involved supporting the government's identity assurance plans that are now gov.uk verify, and at the moment I'm co-chair of the Privacy and Consumer Advisory Group that works closely with Verify and the DCMS digital identity team, also doing some consulting work for the World Bank on digital identity as well.
Great. Well, I don't think I was lying to you all by saying we've got a panel of experts in front of us, which is just amazing. Now, and thank you all so much for being here. Now, before we leap into talking about perhaps the government's response to the call for evidence or the call for views and inputs that we've had, perhaps we just go back to the top level topic of building trust in digital identity and the overall topic of the panel today, just to get anybody who wants to offer any opening remarks or views on why this topic is so important to talk about today, and also your views on where perhaps we are right now and where we need to be moving. I'm going to reverse it. So Edgar, but do you want to kick us off perhaps with some opening remarks or comments from your point of view?
Yeah, so I think particularly in this context, everyone recognizes the potential benefits that digital identity systems can have, whether it's to simplify processes, whether it's to support processes that you can't do because of social distancing, whether it's to address issues of fraud, etc. So the goal of a digital identity system, I think most people will agree with. The interesting questions always arise as to how you go about doing that, so you don't raise and introduce some of the perverse consequences that Lillian talked about in her presentation just earlier, and how you also do it so that the people who would need to use digital identity systems feel that whatever they're engaging with is trustworthy. I think it's the trustworthiness of the system or the process or the ecosystem or whatever that I think is the key one. And so for me, the particularly interesting one is how you go about ensuring that whatever you're going to build is trustworthy and has the checks and balances in place to ensure that.
Great, thanks, Edgar. And I'm sure we'll get into the devil of the detail of how we can actually do that and how we can move forward. But perhaps in my reverse order, Bryn, I think, was next. So opening comments. I should never have gone in reverse order. It's already freaking me out. Bryn, any views of opening comments and remarks on how important this topic is from your point of view?
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating looking at the experience and the amount of time that we've all been working in this space. And certainly, if you look at the dawn of the internet, identity has always been that missing layer, and the fact that we're 30 years later and we've still got no way of reliably recognizing each other online. And that operates 2 ways as well. It's not just about individuals not being able to assert their identity, but it's also that organizations also struggle to demonstrate to the individual that they are who they're claiming to be as well. So I think the trust on the internet really needs to go both ways. One of the things that I think that we've all experienced is, as Edgar pointed out, the fact that digital identity can be transformative, and that if we had a digital identity infrastructure in place, that we really could get trust established on the internet. It's how we actually turn the talk and the many examples that we can all come up with, how we actually get that to be implemented and actually start to change the way that the internet operates by injecting trust into every transaction.
Indeed, and by doing so also address some of the challenges we have online, such as cybercrime and fraud, which really impact everybody. Thank you, Glenn. Bryn, sorry. Michael, to you, opening comments and remarks from you on what is a huge topic, right? It's a lot to unpack here. Oh, I think you're on mute, Michael.
So it's a big topic, and I think we sometimes get caught in some kind of historic thinking on it sometimes, historic roles of identity. So when taking this kind of contact tracing app saga as well, often we only need identity in a sort of intermediate, there's an intermediate step to achieve some other aim. We don't need identity to intrinsically prove that I am who I say I am, to say, get a passport or something like that. So these intermediate steps, we have to pay close attention to the role of platforms, intermediaries, and the power they have in that process. So what we saw with the Bluetooth contact tracing saga, in a way, was many organizations, many countries had suggested a fairly privacy invasive system, which would require individuals to effectively have unique identifiers in the world when they were moving around, interacting with each other. And I think privacy campaigners rightly thought that was problematic and suggested alternative methods, which were less reliant on such identifiers. But what they have done in effect, because of the way that the smartphone ecosystem is taken up, is that the identity function using privacy technologies has been incorporated into the operating system of smartphones. So the ability to say, deliver messages from devices, to authenticate messages from other devices, and to run an entire infrastructure designed to do something that we would usually think would need identification, triggering if you've met anybody, is now part of a platform ecosystem. And we don't have much accountability over that. So we can imagine, and we can talk about having trusted third parties and third-party agencies and verifiers and all of that. But if we miss the elephant in the room, which is there are platforms that their entire business model is to make individuals legible to the world and to sell access to those individuals, then we miss the trick a bit from a political economy point of view. So I think what we've seen with COVID is a highlighting of some of these real powers in this space that haven't always been so obvious before. And I think lastly, what I want to say is that Sue was talking about the challenge around privacy and trust and bringing everybody forward on board with this. We have amazing privacy technologies. I know people in digital identity have been working for a long time on zero knowledge attestation and things like that. We have amazing privacy technologies, but we can also miss the wood for we can miss the forest for the trees in some of these areas, because what we want to maybe control as a society is the use of these technologies and the way they're used to program and change and orchestrate entire populations. So we focus only on ensuring confidentiality around privacy. We miss the fact that we have put middle actors who are responsible for an identity layer, and we've given them the ability to effectively, right now, to force huge populations to self-isolate. In the US, we see concerns about voters being forced to stay at home by misuse of contact tracing systems, for example. So you've really got an ability to program populations. There's a term from Seda Gerses, who's a professor at TU Delft. And I think that's something we should be concerned about and needs to be brought into the discussion of who controls the identity layer and what's it used for.
Oh, absolutely. There are questions around how do we get this right for the UK, but then there are broader ethical questions around the impact that these technologies could have on society and the broader point of view that we need to be thinking about as well. Absolutely, and I'm sure we'll get into those as we go. Thank you, Michael. Julie, some opening comments or remarks from your side, and then we'll open it up into a discussion about where we are right now, particularly with the government's response on what that tells us, and what that means in terms of moving forward. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you. And just picking up on a few threads that different people have mentioned, I think absolutely at the moment the key angle really is looking at the economic drivers. Where we are now at the end of 2020, all economies across the world are looking at how can they rebuild, and knowing who someone is, enabling them to participate economically, enabling them to participate civically, and also letting people manage their health and interact both with other citizens and with businesses and with governments is really key. So for many years, businesses have looked at who is my customer and have looked at how to streamline that. Governments are just starting to get a grip on that some of those cost savings, benefits and economics really are needed across government and across government departments. And for many years, there have been high-level discussions across, say, the UK and Canada, through to Australia, New Zealand, Singapore. And I think now all of those governments are looking at, we need to get best practice internally, but also we need to look at that interoperability, and we need to look at accessibility to not leave citizens behind. And I think when we're looking at accessibility, I always think of the 3 Ds. It's devices, it's what the root documents are, and it's across disabilities as well. So there's a wide range of things to unpick within access, which, going back to Edgar's point with regards perverse consequences, is really important at the moment. But at the bottom line, this is the economy. This is global economies, and this is stopping, spiraling declines. I'm privileged to take part in the World Economics Forum's Digital Identity Innovators Group, and looking for all economies at that 3 to 8% GDP uplift is where everybody is going to be focused. But ensuring that we don't leave the most vulnerable behind, and looking at people's lives online in the fullest sense. And I think later I will bring up some other points on the age angle, which, if you look at utility for individuals, comes up again and again. So we need to look at how this works for individuals, how it works for governments, and how it works for businesses overall.
Absolutely, and how we get this right. And next steps really seems to be where we are right now in terms of the conversation we've been having for quite some time seems to be moving forward for many different reasons, which I'm sure we'll touch on today, the COVID crisis, of course, being a main one. But let's start perhaps with the state of the debate around digital identity in the UK right now, looking particularly at the government's recent digital identity call for evidence response, which we've seen in the last couple of weeks. And I think it'd be good to get a bit of a sense check from you all in terms of what you saw the response saying, what it does well, or what it perhaps is missing from the response. So starting top level, people's response to the response itself in terms of what was published by government. Who would like to kick off with that? Julie, maybe?
Sure. Thank you, Sue, with pleasure. So yes, you were quite right that it was, shall we say, hotly anticipated. And I think on the positive side, what we started to see is that this is resonating across UK government, across all different departments. And hopefully we will start to see more and more of that. I think everybody is keen to see the next level of detail underneath these top lines, and indeed making much clearer the devil in the detail and having a clear timeline is going to be absolutely key, both for the privacy groups, for businesses and for citizens to really understand this. And different levels of layered education will be needed to explain to people really the impact of this. I think some of us might have been quite concerned by some of the sensationalist headlines in some newspapers where it was really clear that some journalists hadn't got a grip on what this could actually do. And in some instances, there was quite a bit bit of scaremongering. Absolutely, we want transparency. We want things like more data sources to be opened up. But this is a good step in the right direction if we can get within a reasonable timeline to see a lot more detail and specifics, would be my opening remarks.
Edgar, maybe come to you from your point of view. What was your response to the publication, and it was everything in there, I suppose, that you were wanting to see?
So we were very lucky in the Privacy and Consumer Advisory Group to have had engagement with DCMS shortly after the consultation closed. So in terms of what was in the responses to the call for evidence, very pleased to see a strong emphasis on privacy, a strong emphasis on standards. So what's particularly interesting now that the team has been able to produce the government's response is to see the details of details is precisely not what's there yet. The next steps about what they want to do, how they want to go about doing that. But in terms of the principles that seem to be underlying what government sees as its way forward, there's a lot there that I agree with, subject to specifically what does this actually mean in practice. So my colleague Chris Pounder has done a nice blog piece where he's questioned the lack of specificity in the principles in this document. I assume that's deliberately done because this is a direction of travel rather than a fully thought through policy. But in terms of a direction of travel, there's a lot that I can see and welcome. And I think the really important one is this move from digital identity that's been working reasonably well for accessing government services to trying to open this out to a digital identity that you can use across both public and private sector activities. And in particular, not losing the user experience from that. It's all good and well saying, well, we've got lots of different innovations come from different kinds of companies, but that might result in you having to prove your identity to 10 different private sector companies to do 10 different sets of activities. So there's an important element about remembering the end user and trying to simplify their experience as far as possible, whilst also recognizing, as has been raised in the questions, the issue of those who are digitally excluded or don't necessarily have good enough evidence to support the identity proving that many of these systems require.
Thanks, Edgar. That's a few things to pick up on there, but before we do so, Michael, interested in your response to the response. And Edgar's right in terms of it was a response to the call for evidence, right? It's a direction of travel. It's perhaps the start of the conversation, but it's the next step that we've been looking for to have the next step of the conversation. Particularly in terms of interested in your views on the principles that are in there around, it recognizes the principles of privacy, transparency, good governance, proportionality. What's your take on the response that we have right now?
Thanks. So yeah, I mean, it's obviously going to recognize these principles, and it goes through them. It's got some interesting sections on new technology, and it's got the interesting distributive ledgers, which I assume is a form of radical Marxist blockchain snake oil. I'm looking forward to a distributive ledger. But beyond that, I think there are still some elephants in the room with this whole type of document. Well, one of them is that the entire when we look at the organizations' interest in providing identity layers, many of them are also data brokers, heavily involved in data broker markets, which in the UK have been woefully unregulated by a regulator that does not have the ability or resource to address any of those systemic issues of trust. And indeed, the same actors that come up, such as Experian or Oracle, are under investigation by DPAs around the world with little redress or movement there, and I don't think that's going to be a great promoter of trust in those areas. So it does lack the idea that the UK needs to, in order to be a world leader in providing or supporting digital identity, needs to be seen as somewhere with an independent supervisory authority that can look over the sector. Otherwise, also, it's not going to get adequacy with either the European Union or, frankly, the countries that every week are adopting similar laws and will get adequacy with the European Union. So it decides which side of the battle you're on is key. And I think the other part that is missing from this, again, both this response and the discussion more generally, is the business model of the providers of some of these identity systems. So who is actually funding these? What is it, a cross subsidy from another revenue stream? What use can they make of the data and infrastructure that they are building for other commercial ends, and how will that interact with trust? In this sense, more transparency about these business models, but also quite hard restrictions and firewalls on the kind of business models that can be combined with a trusted identity layer, I think would be required. Because if you don't, you get a situation like Google with which is you're running nice services like Docs and Mail that a lot of people like and enjoy and use really usefully, but it's cross-subsidizing from an industry which many people believe is operating illegally, or at least facilitating illegal activity. And we don't necessarily, I don't think we want to be in another situation like ad tech, where we have a useful, societally important digital layer like identity cross-subsidized by, frankly, illegal activity. And we're in a real concerning space if we go there. So I think we do have to address those issues more head-on to have a stronger ambition, because otherwise we're going to be left behind, because I think we'll be taken aback by how other countries maybe do invest in infrastructure when we choose to sort of try and do it on the cheap with cross-subsidies, which will not be supported by many countries' legal regimes.
Right, thank you, Michael. Bryn, your views on the government's response?
Yeah, I think picking up on the point that Julie made, it was interesting to see that the government's response did make it to the press. So that's a really positive thing. But what's perhaps disappointing from that is that some of the messages that the press actually picked up on were, as Julie pointed out, quite scaremongering messages that apparently Dominic Cummings is going to anoint us all with a digital identity, and that's in the form of a number. I'm not quite sure quite where they got that from. So I think that there's some broader education that needs to happen within the marketplace, and that we need to make sure that these messages are clearly getting into the press and are being addressed properly. With that, I think that there's also another topic that, if you look at the organisations that actually responded to the consultation, there were perhaps half a dozen organisations who you would definitely put into the category of a relying party, so a consumer of identity. If you count the organisations that could sit in either the identity attribute provider bucket as well, that perhaps goes up to around about a dozen organisations. And really, we're not going to make a difference in the world unless digital identities are useful to people. And identities being useful means that there are many places where an identity is accepted. So there's definitely some work to do from a government perspective to actually make sure that organisations are incentivized to consume digital identities. So that, for me, is one key topic that can definitely be addressed out of this. The response itself, in some ways, was actually quite factual. It was a summary of the responses that were received rather than the government's perspective on the responses. So it was quite factual, but also I think useful that there were some very key themes that were coming through. So one of those themes was around making sure that governments opened up data sources so that people could actually use the data that government hold about them to be able to prove their identity. And I know that the government has recently announced the private sector use of passport data as a pilot activity. But I think government need to ensure that they're looking across the different data sets that they hold about individuals. So I noticed there's a question in the Q&A about inclusion, and really it's the data sources that all organizations hold about us that will ensure that we get fully inclusive digital identity and people having the ability to prove that they are who they claim to be. Government really should be leading on that and setting the example. So opening up data sources from DWP, HMRC, as well as passport and driver license data. With that, there also needs to be some very good governance in place so that we don't continue the legacy ways of doing things where anyone can get access to your data and then you find out whether it really was the person who should be accessing it. So there's always a chicken and egg scenario with opening up those data sources, and that's where good governance comes in. I think one of the other themes that came through was that the role of the private sector in this as well. So whilst government can set the framework and the foundation, really for innovation to come through and for the real user experience that people are going to engage with, we need the private sector involved. So it really needs to be a public-private sector partnership on that. And the third theme that I would call out is that whilst government have been addressing the topic of digital identity, we're still in a situation where other legislation prevents the use of digital identities. So I can't prove my age in order to buy alcohol because the Licensing Act says that I need a hologram or a UV security feature in my identity document. I can't rent a property, or I can't gain employment using my digital identity because the legislation says that the physical document's got to be in the hand of the person checking it. So we need to make sure that other legislation is brought up to date to really support the use of digital identity and make sure that it can be used across contexts.
Thanks, Bryn. Thank you all. There's a hell of a lot there to explore. And some great questions on the chat that have already some themes. Edgar, did I see your hand? Yeah. Was that a hand? I feel like a school mistress. Was that your hand up?
Yes, that was.
Go ahead.
So I think this kind of ties in, Bryn's last comment about the laws and the regulations ties in very nicely with the COVID situation, because there has been understandably a lot of temporary relaxation of the formal requirements for physically inspecting documents, etc., etc. So to the extent that those laws have been identified as things where, at least for the time being, we can do a temporary fix, we're starting to get an indication of where that move to digital identity can come about. But equally, there's also the risk that by doing that and allowing different measures and different mechanisms, we also potentially increase the risk of fraud. Because if you've not got a standardized, properly thought through way of doing things, allowing something quick and dirty as a temporary measure might get you through the emergency issues that COVID is raising, but can lead to much longer term problems. And we've already seen HMRC talking about the millions of fake identities that were being used for furlough and the self-employment support scheme. So great to be able to identify where those gaps are and what rules need changing, and the idea of identifying the stupid identity requirements that we actually have. But also need to bear in mind that we don't just want to reduce and remove all of these regulations so that we don't have any problems in the future. So it's a fine balancing act.
Absolutely. We've had a number of, Julie, was there a question you wanted to raise?
Yes, I just thought there was a really nice sort of segue. If maybe, Edgar, you might give a little bit more clarity in terms of the role of PCAG, because one of the things I would have really loved to have seen maybe in this paper was stating how PCAG fits within the governance and fits within, for example, going forwards, more of a move towards structures for redress, structures that will monitor accessibility. And I wondered if you could explain anything more, maybe for people that don't know about PCAG, about its origins briefly, but also where you see it moving over the next period of this crucial time for the UK with digital identity.
Okay, so I'll start with the easy one, which is the origins. So 2010, the coalition government agrees to scrap the previous digital identity card scheme, and the Cabinet Office said, let's get together some of these people who had been raising some of the tough questions on the detail around the concerns of the previous scheme, and also who had some quite good, sensible suggestions about how you can build a identity system that will resolve some of those concerns. Because obviously, just because you had a new government in 2010 didn't mean that you avoided the problem of having to prove who you were reliably to government services. So a group of us were set up, were invited to a number of meetings that then became the Privacy and Consumer Advisory Group, initially for what was, as the government labelled it, the Identity Assurance Scheme, that then became gov.uk Verify. And we would, at the very beginning, we had kind of monthly meetings with the team where we get updates, and we would ask the kind of informed, detailed, tough questions. So if you do need to keep the records for audit purposes, how can you go about doing that in a way that doesn't introduce new privacy risks, etc., etc. Because we have a very good working relationship with the Verify team, we've also then been working with other parts of government. We had a lot of involvement on the Digital Economy Act, the data sharing elements, and both Louise Bennett and I are on the 2 review boards for the Digital Economy Act data sharing agreements, one for the fraud and debt and one for the public service delivery. And given both our kind of boring technical detail questions around digital identity, obviously also working very closely with the DCMS team, we had our last meeting before the response before the government's response came out. So in terms of potential next steps, we haven't had any formal conversations, so I can't kind of make any promises, but certainly everyone's keen for us to remain involved and to make sure that the elements of the principles that both we developed for gov.uk Verify, that are also echoed in the kind of direction of travel from the government's response, we hope to maintain and continue working with. So I can't say anything more specific just because we've not had those conversations.
Thanks, Edgar. That's really helpful. And I think we've seen a bit of a theme, and I'm going to bring in some of the questions as we go, I think, guys, rather than leave them all to the end, because the idea is that we have a bit of a conversation here. It's going to bring up questions from you guys listening, and please do keep sending them in, and forgive me if we don't get to all of them because there's a lot here, but a theme of trust and making sure that we bring and we make sure that vulnerable people are not digitally excluded from this, and that which we've already touched on already, and that we make sure that we get this right for everybody. A question which, forgive me, Bryn, is slightly challenging, but I'm going to bring it to you in terms of, there's a lot of question around trust of digital identity schemes, and a question around well, what means that industry can do this any better than government? What could industry help to get this right and to make sure that there is trust? Just trying to find the question. It's escaped me at the moment, but I'm just wondering from an industry point of view there, how do we get this trust right, or how do we build trust, and what is industry looking at? How do we get that right?
Yeah, so I don't think that this is a conversation that governments can't do digital identity and private sector can. So that it isn't a true statement. There are schemes around the world where government have implemented digital identity and they've done a really great job at it. There are other instances where private sector have done it, and both both situations can equally occur. For me, where the real strength comes in is when public and private sector organizations work together, because that makes sure that that you cover all the market, you make sure that you're delivering an inclusive scheme so that people aren't excluded. So, you know, it would be very easy for tech providers to come in who've got a user base selling £1,000 handsets, but that wouldn't be beneficial to the whole of society. So we need to make sure that we've got that partnership so that we don't end up with a situation of haves and have-nots. For me, I think part of the challenge for government use cases, so gov.uk Verify has been used within the public sector. It hasn't made it into the private sector. And as an individual, if you go and pay your taxes and you need to get a digital identity because of that, it's not particularly engaging to you as an individual. You're doing it because you're effectively forced to do it rather than that you're actually choosing to do it. And so I think, again, that kind of situation, it's not very exciting paying my taxes once a year. I've got this digital identity, but I don't really know what it is. I don't really care what it is either. It's not going to create a thriving digital identity system. So we need to make sure that there's the balance between use cases of what I have to do and also what I want to do. And right. I think if we can start to build these partnerships, the role of private sector is to concentrate on the commercial models for it, to make sure that there is actually a reason for organizations doing this. And I note the comment that Michael made about how is it funded for a private sector organization? Is it the Google model of I will offer you free services and in return for that, I want to know everything about you? I don't think that that's necessarily a good commercial model to follow. But at the same time, we do need to make sure that there is a commercial model, that this is actually a viable thing, and a commercial model doesn't have to be a bad thing, doesn't need to be evil.
And that comes on to actually a question we did have, which I was looking to bring in, but we've come on to it a little bit with the government's response. Edgar, you mentioned the role of standards, and I think what we're talking about here is, if you build a digital identity infrastructure, a framework, an approach in the UK, how do we, what do we need to put in place to make this work, and to bring to your points in terms of, the market structures. So we had a question of around international standards. Does the UK look to set these, or particularly if we thinking about interoperability, I suppose reading into it, should we be following international standards? Should the UK be setting this? And actually, are we already too late to this discussion? Michael, I was interested in your views on this in terms of the conversation now, where we are now, given that we've had the responses. And a question I wanted to ask you guys is, well, what happens next? And obviously the conversation needs to be, okay, if we're going to develop this infrastructure, we're going to develop this market, we're going to develop this approach, how do we get these things right in terms of standards, the rules of the road? How do we do this? So your views on that, and also whether the UK should be looking to set this ourselves and drive this forward, and could we be an international champion of how to do this well, or should we be following international standards? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. I think maybe at the risk of sounding like a broken record here, firstly, the UK is a tiny actor in this whole space, and it's not. And then again, so are almost every country. So is almost every country, because the actors in this space are the actors that control mobile devices, and we operate at their pleasure. We operate at the pleasure of Apple and Google, who may allow certain kinds of interoperability with either their actual fundamental hardware, They mediate access between what apps can use, and they also increasingly control, as the audience here will be well aware of, the entire web standards layer and internet standards layer through really controlling infrastructure and having very, very dominant voices in forum like the IGF, but also particularly IETF, W3C, which is, you know, got its own challenges of relevance with the browser market. So you've got this enclosure. If you want to say, well, the UK or any other country or Estonia or wherever has its standard that's allowed to, that should be integrated or should be used, you have to force these platforms to reliably and permanently allow a national standard into its ecosystem. You have to leverage it open, and you have to keep it open, because you are always at risk of being disintermediated at any time. If you decide to operate at the pleasure of these companies that say, well, we'll integrate this approach through APIs into our apps, into the web layer, in a way that people can conveniently access using the most powerful computers that many people have today, which is the phone in their pocket, then you really risk one day that being turned off. Geopolitically, that can be turned off by the US, by anywhere else. It can be turned off because the companies want to change a standard or operate in a different way. And so unless the law gets involved, and as many countries come together and say, we have a vision for how the role the state should play with things like identity layers, but not just identity layers, and how they interact with smartphones, and we will legally construct a way to keep that open so that we can enable small businesses to interact with these large platforms. Because if you don't, then you will find they will effectively get eaten, I think, in many ways. So that's kind of the question around standards. It's not a question of UK or EU or US. It's really a question of countries versus these platforms. And they can dance around and have a good idea, but I really don't see that being, we should stop thinking about the UK on the international stage and start thinking about countries on a platform walled garden stage. Okay, I think Edgar wants to come in, and then I'll come to Julie on this point. Edgar?
Yeah, so absolutely, Michael's bang on the money in terms of how you, I phrase it slightly differently, regulate the ecosystem beyond those that you have direct control over. So for gov.uk verify, a number of certified companies, and as part of the contracts that that the government had with those companies to provide the digital identity services, the identity proofing, that's the constraint that you can put into place. The question then comes, if you use those standards in a wider marketplace, even just within the UK, what kinds of controls can you put in? What kinds of strong firewalls, as Michael said, can you put in place for somebody who says, well, we are complying with government standards, but equally we're making a bit of money because we're doing profiling of your data or whatever. I think there is an interesting role for the UK in terms of standards. There are some things like authentication, which are essentially technical standards where the UK has good experience, but it's not necessarily going to be the driver. But if you've got a standard, why not use it rather than anybody else's? One feature that the UK does have, and that's typical for many common law countries, is the absence of that kind of central citizen number that's given at birth, etc. And so as a result of not having that, we do have particular expertise about how you draw on multiple data sources, the kinds of things that Bryn was talking about, from passports, driving licenses, tax records, DWP records or whatever, and how you can combine those to give you confidence that the person in front of you or the organization in front of you is the organization or the person that you think it is, to a level of confidence, to a level of assurance that you need. So there, again, when we talk about standards, we need to talk about, well, which kinds of standards, which particular standards, and that's certainly an area where the UK, just because of the history of how it came to develop its own government systems, has particular advantages that can help for the global marketplace.
Thanks, Edgar. Julie, I know you wanted to come in on this topic.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think one of the big changes that happened in the last year was with regards to the NFC chip read. And that has meant that literally around the world, we could have one platform of the large platforms overnight say to people, would you like to add your driving license to your XYZ, your Facebook, your Instagram, your, whichever type of platform. And that could radically overnight change the whole landscape. There was a huge furore about a year ago about Libra and how financial services could be, attacked by the spectre of social media platforms taking or encroaching in that area. And yet there doesn't seem to have been on a global level by the EU, by the UK or other global regulators, a huge amount of activity. So we know that the simplest document, maybe not with the most security features, but the more prevalent tends to be the driving license. And in standards committees around the world, there are lots of approaches in terms of developing the digital driver's license, which would be very easy on one of those platforms to trial out. And actually here in the UK, we even had murmurs of that a few years ago through the DVLA. So I think our CMA does need to be vigilant. But we do need to have more clarity, for example, with the IDIS. How can IDPs in the UK that might not currently be part of Verify actually basically avail of the UK's current membership into EIDIS, or give clarity as to how do organisations work more with other national infrastructures in the EU to access that. More clarity with regards the verified credentials, if the WC3 route or OpenID Connect route is going to be the one to go. For credentials, it's going to be really important, particularly with the health pandemic, that we look at how players can operate there. And looking at, I think there was a really good point with regards the UK does have experience in terms of other proxies that can be used as attributes. And I think we need to go even further with that. So we've said parity of acceptance of documents, but we need to look at issuing of certificates. So if somebody doesn't have a passport or driving license, and we know that's 24% of adults and 33% of under 18s, and it tends to be a CDE demographic. What other things? Is that your GCSE? Is that your Duke of Edinburgh's? What are other things that prove that you have existed in the UK that could start to be a marker in the absence of us having a population that has a central citizen number? So looking at those other forms of data and labeling and having a clearer view as to how the DVLA is also going to come on stream, looking more broadly across the different organisations in the UK that are part of this mix. So I'm hoping that in this new Digital Identity Strategy Board, they are going to bring people through from the CMA, from the DVLA, and also have a clear agenda which organisations like ours should be able to feed into and understand what is going to be the future requirements on the accessibility front, on the transparency front, and on redress, because that would give everybody a much clearer view as to that landscape going forwards. That would also increase investment into the UK, because one of the things we've had with the Digital Economy Act is a volte-face, and the government taking one tack and then changing its mind. We need to restore and rebuild faith in the UK as somewhere that is investable in terms of digital tech in this area. And we need to show that those different government departments, as well as industry, through bodies such as the Open Identity Exchange, the Tech UK Digital Identity Group, the APPG, that there is an alignment and there is discussion and there is that both transparency and collaboration to achieve these joint goals in the principles.
Thanks, Julie. Bryn, I think you wanted to come in on this as well before we move on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree in the importance of standards, and I think that the work that the UK government's done in establishing those standards has actually been really important on a global stage as well. So we have got the international standards. We do have alignment across those standards as well, so that we begin to get interoperability. And that is absolutely important to developing a digital identity infrastructure that works across the globe. One thing that I would caution, though, around standards is that we need to make sure that we're not over specifying or overreaching the role of standards. There's been a lot of mention about regulators for digital identity. The challenge at the moment is there isn't really a market to be regulated. So we need to make sure that we don't put in place additional barriers that stop the creation of digital identity infrastructures before we've actually really got started in this. One of the things that we did at Mastercard was we published our principles almost a couple of years ago now, because we do believe that there is a right way of implementing digital identity, and it's not about marketing, it's not about big data initiatives and putting the control in. So I fully agree with Michael's point on that we should make sure that that those things don't happen in the ecosystem, and we should be operating to high principles and high standards of operation. But we need to allow some innovation in the market. We need to let the market work. If you look at gov.uk Verify, when that was launched, it was launched with only level of assurance 2, and it was very, very tough for the vast majority of people to actually achieve that standard. The data sources weren't available in order to allow people to prove their identities, in order to allow the identity providers to meet that standard, apart from for people who were top of bell curve, that did have a digital financial footprint, did have passports, did have driver's licenses. So we need to take care and make sure that we don't go too far in terms of specifying those standards. But at the same time, trust is really hard to earn. It's very easy to erode that trust. And what we don't want as an organization, we don't want fly-by-night companies coming in and eroding that trust. We don't want the giant tech players coming in and using digital identity as a means of marketing or tracking or eroding privacy. So it's getting that balance right that's absolutely crucial.
I think Michael wants to come in on this, but this is where I was kind of wanting to move the conversation on, in terms of, we talk a lot about trust and trustworthiness, and how do we get this right? Transparency always seems to me to be the key word here, and obviously we've done a lot around the work around different approaches organizations can take, whether it's ethics boards or strategy boards, or putting in place tools and ability to have that transparency throughout the process of these technologies. I'm just wondering whether there's a role for that kind of approach to work here as well. But Michael, I don't know if you've got a view on that, or you were looking to come in anyway.
Just on two things. One of them is a bit relevant to that. The first thing, I think, is to push back on the idea that there actually is a market here. And I don't mean that there is a market in the sense there's a demand. What I mean is that when you have large platforms and infrastructures, nothing functions like a market anymore, because they basically decide, that infrastructure decides who can see who and at what price, and who is visible to anyone else. The market logic implies, that whole of neoclassical economics implies that sort of free in the ether and can be located and observed. And when you've got large tech infrastructures, I'm afraid markets do not function. Markets is not the right metaphor to, we're not in a market selling each other's goods and bartering. We are operating in a very, very different regime. So that's, I think, the first thing to bear in mind when we're talking about these at all. And it's misleading when we talk about markets. And that's not a particularly ideological point about anything. It's just more of an observation about, I think, how these dynamics work. Secondly, the question about privacy. I'm personally not worried about, say, Apple and Google coming in and eroding privacy using these systems. In fact, I think the worry is the opposite. I think they have much higher ability to produce and perform certain types of privacy than any other provider, particularly because if you have a device, with Apple, for example, they have control right from the software layer and the cloud layer all the way down to the hardware layer and secure enclaves and other forms of trusted computing inside the device, which other providers don't have access to. So they can credibly and correctly say, your data is much more private with us. You can have it locally on device, synchronized across them. You can do zero knowledge attestation. You can do things that are are trusted with single points of trust. For example, like trusted computing, you trust Intel, and they can also do private computation over the whole lot using multi-party computation or forms of local differential privacy that only work at huge scale. And the problem there is power. The problem there is they then get to choose who can enter and leave this game, and they get to choose who can use certain identity systems and who can't, and under what conditions. The problem there is power, not privacy. And privacy is not going to be, it's always a small UK company is always going to be able to produce less privacy than Apple or Google can, because they do not control the infrastructure. And I think we have to come to terms with that. And if we want that not to be the case, we want to be able to compete on privacy and be able to offer the higher standards of privacy, which I think I see Sue nodding, I think we do here, because it's going to, it would be what makes the UK a leader if it can be. We need to open up access to the whole hardware layer. So you say you have a legal right as a small UK startup to be able to use secure hardware on an Apple device. Because if you don't, you operate at Apple's pleasure and they will disintermediate you at a moment's notice.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, I was going to ask, what does this tell us about the state of the debate around digital identity in the UK? But it seems to me that it's extremely lively right now. And I know, and many of us have been talking about this for many years, but it feels like we're really getting to some of the big thorny questions, as Michael raises, that we'll need to work through as we go forward. But does everybody have the same sense to me that it feels like we're at a step change? It feels like the debate is gathering pace, which is good. You know, we need to have this debate. We need to understand these issues and identify them and find solutions to overcome them. But does everybody feel like this is a turning point? Anybody? Julie?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. We're in a really interesting juxtaposition moment from a year ago. But I think Michael's point was really valid. If you look in the UK for public sector, there's only two and effectively one player providing digital identity services into UK government that's remaining from the original 7 or so in Verify. So until the autumn of next year, at the earliest, the whole of this ecosystem is waiting to happen for the public sector side for UK. And those existing players are keen to also work and operate in the private sector. But what's needed is this parity of acceptance of digital identity across both public and private sector, and an opening up to actually create this marketplace, which hasn't as yet really existed. We've had a couple of waves, but the last wave of entrants to Verify, there's only been exits for the last sort of 4 years approximately. So what we're looking for is this new lie of the land, and yes, for it to meet all of these other different changes, because without that, the UK will not be able to meet the needs of citizens, meet the needs of governments, or streamline the economy. And that, I think, we're really on the cusp of that. And COVID adds an additional element of we have health data to deal with in a different way. So if you looked even 6 months ago and you looked at, say, just Tech UK as an organisation, health would have been thought of as its own health tech bubble. But rapidly it's been realised that you need global solutions for digital identity, health credentialing across the globe, and how we look at sensitive data and the sharing of that, the privacy preserving elements and the inclusion, all the things that this community has been discussing. So yes, we're at a real changing period of time, and if anything it's accelerated, and people say anything from sort of like 2 to 20 years in terms of both the interest and the focus, but it's put a laser sharp spotlight on this area. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I wanted to come on to talking about the impact of the COVID pandemic on the debate, and where that perhaps has shifted, or has that been the real shift. So I'm going to leave my, just as a advanced warning to you all, my final question before we close today will be what's the 1 or 2 things that you want to see happen next to move us forward in the UK. But you're in a privileged position. I don't usually give panelists an advanced warning, so there you go. But coming back to the impact of the coronavirus pandemic, the COVID-19 situation on the debate on digital identity, has that really changed the conversation? Has that been one of the major factors here? Edgar, be interested in your views on that. How has the pandemic, do you think, shifted has it shifted the debate, the parameters of the debate, or just in terms of has brought it to light in terms of the way digital identity could help us in the situation that we're all facing right now and will be going forward?
So I think there's two sides to that. So there's lots of people kind of posting on social media about what has transformed your company's digital operations. Was it external consultants? Was it your CIO? Or was it COVID-19? And the joke is, of course, it was COVID that forced you to do things that perhaps you didn't think that you could do previously. But I also worry about you use the phrase accelerating activities, because there are some things that you probably could get round to doing that this has kind of forced you to do it. So working from home, being able to do remote meetings, thinking about whether you need to do face-to-face, etc., etc. So it clearly has been accelerated. But then there's also acceleration which then misses out, or you get the quick fix that doesn't think about those additional consequences of whatever it is that you are proposing. So in terms of health credentials, the Ada Lovelace review that Michael and Lillian and I, amongst many others, were involved with, in addition to the what data is being shared, etc., there's also the very, it's those kind of next steps from accelerating. Let's imagine that we've got this fantastic digital credential that we can use to prove, well, it previously was that you were immune or that you had antibodies or something. And now with Project Moonshot, ignoring the fact that the science isn't there, it will be that you were tested this morning, and as of this morning, you didn't seem to have COVID, so you could now go in and do that. That might make a lot of sense, might get a lot of public acceptance for being able to go to football matches or concerts or Glastonbury or whatever. But then let's start adding other things. Well, if we can do it for that, let's also see whether or not you've been recently tested for being overweight, for being susceptible to alcoholism, for having sickle cell disease, if you want to add a racial element into that, for possibly having heightened mood swings around depression. And it then again gets you to this very important overall regulatory environment that says, are we going to allow this just to be used for COVID? Well, why not COVID and cancer? Why not COVID, cancer, heart disease? Why not COVID? Or is this going to be will we build this technology for this one particular pandemic-related set of diseases? But actually, this could be for employers, for 0 hours contracts or whatever, be really, really useful as a way of controlling the workforce much more generally. And how do we suddenly say, hang on a second, this nice app, this nice infrastructure, this nice access to the secure enclave that we've allowed for COVID-related things, because everyone can see the benefits of that, can now not be also used for innovations in other kinds of spaces as well.
Thanks, Edgar. Apologies. We've got some questions coming in as well. So just trying to field that. Interested in terms of views on that, in terms of how do we then take this forward? How do we, you know, what does this mean in terms of going forward? But thinking about where we are right now, Bryn, I suppose from your view, what have you seen in terms of has in your work the COVID and the Corona conversation really brought digital ID to people that perhaps haven't been talking about this before?
So certainly we've experienced lots of comments about if only we had a digital identity infrastructure. So the opportunities where digital identity can help, I think, have been brought into sharp focus. But I think it was Edgar that made the point earlier that because we're in a situation where we are having to operate remotely, where the digital identity infrastructure isn't in place, that we've lessened controls and made things work, and fraudsters have taken opportunity of that, but it's always that balance. I think last week the UK government put an advert in the press to ask whether anyone knew where their £3.5 billion of furlough payments had gone to. You know, drop a postcard with the answer if you could help the government find that money again. And it's those kind of things where if we did have a digital identity infrastructure, the furlough payment scheme would have been so much easier to implement. The track and trace system would have been so much easier to implement. From Friday, the venues, pubs, restaurants are now going to have to take people's names, address, emails as a mandatory step rather than a voluntary step. We've seen Singapore have had the QR system in place for doing that, are getting 10 million check-ins a day using that system. In the UK, we're still reliant on the owner of the premises to write that detail down on a bit of paper and hope that it doesn't go missing. As individuals, we're responsible for giving out accurate information rather than just making up a name and an email address to fulfill that requirement. So there's lots of good reasons why we should use this as a reason for implementing digital identity. I'm quite skeptical as to whether it will actually happen. Will other things actually overtake the need for digital identity? You know, vaccinations coming in will start to change people's focus. So we have a real opportunity. I'm not convinced that just because that opportunity exists, we will actually capitalize on it. We need bold leadership in government, in private sector to actually make it happen. And I do believe that there is a market for digital identity. And it's not just about my name, my date of birth. It's about the other attributes that go along with that. So if I can prove my university qualifications so that I can apply for a job, there is significant cost saving to the organizations involved in doing that. And that's where the market comes in.
Michael, be interested in your reflections on the pandemic and whether it shifted the debate and the conversation. I suppose thinking about it as where we were talking about it before and perhaps where we're talking about it now. But also I've got a question that wondered if yourself and perhaps as we move on to Julie as well, might have a view on lively discussion underway. I think I agree with you guys, but it hasn't spilled it into Parliament, mainstream media or political parties. And perhaps it's one that's being a conversation within the tech sector at the moment. So how do we broaden that out? Is that a need that you see as well, that we need to broaden this conversation wider than perhaps where it is right now? So two elements there. What's shifted in the debate, or has the pandemic shifted the debate and discussion from what you've seen? And Julie, feel free to come in on these two as well. But then also, how do we move forward? How do we perhaps shift the debate even further to a broader conversation where it's not just people that are working in digital ID that are having this conversation, it's broader? Thoughts, views?
On the second part, certainly there's no, you read any manifesto, they've almost never got anything very interesting about the digital world to say in them. We don't have a normative vision of a healthy internet or a digital world we want to be in. It's not part of the political discourse, and certainly it needs to be in the UK because there are lots of political issues that are tied into it. I think I push back on Bryn a little bit and say, well, I don't know, actually having worked in this space quite closely throughout the pandemic in different countries, I'm not sure we have evidence that says countries that operate either ID or digital ID systems are better at contact tracing or have had better outcomes in the pandemic. In particular, actually Singapore had some pretty bad outcomes when there were huge portions of the country that were excluded from these kind of systems that were effectively ignored when they were operating. And indeed, a QR code system doesn't require any digital identity. Most of the aspects that we talk about during the pandemic actually showed that there's very little use for digital identity in these spaces. Contact tracing was effectively what you had to do is alert an individual. You didn't need to know a permanent identity of that person. And in fact, I think people were worried that if you did, that would deter participation in that entire scheme to begin with. People wouldn't carry their phones around. They wouldn't turn their Bluetooth on. They wouldn't check in to areas. There's serious concern about balancing this, because if you want participation in an invasive scheme, you may not want people to be identified with their exact information, but you may want them to be contactable, which is what the exposure notification and system was really based on doing, was working with epidemiologists to maximize that sweet spot of trust and adoption. And similarly, you can see that in England, the long-awaited English contact tracing app, which is all the other regions effectively, apart from England and Wales, have already launched different versions now, contains a QR code system which operates totally locally. It stores the QR codes only on the device and just publishes a list to devices of places that have been flagged and the times they were flagged as infected or the like. And at that point, your device is notified. I think at the moment they just notifies you, but in theory you can then say that device then sends your phone number to Public Health England who could call you. Doesn't need digital identity system, no need for one. And there's no benefit from that. And again, if there was a digital identity system which said everybody wasn't, that located people in that place at a particular time in a central database, people may not want to check in. So we do miss some of the actual benefits of this intervention. And I think we should bear in mind that the one thing I think has been revealed, especially looking around countries in Europe from this pandemic, is the risk of digital identity systems to destroy policy interventions' effectiveness and to create chilling effects. We shouldn't always run to the identity part as the first port of call. We must work backwards from the intervention and what we want to achieve and what we don't want to achieve, the failure modes of it as well.
Very interesting. And we had a question earlier which actually questioned whether we should be using the word identity as part of this debate and discussion as well, and whether whether we should be using more plain language in terms of what we're talking about here, which is another interesting. We've only got 10 minutes left, but that could be a panel all in itself, right? Are we getting the terminology? Are we getting the language? Are we getting the words that we use right here as well? But Julie, feel free to touch on that, but also I see that's 3 things I've piled on you. It's the beauty of coming at the end. Apologies, but views on the shifting debate around the pandemic, how we broaden out this debate as well, or anything else you've heard from the other panelists.
No, I think the debate is starting to shift, and I mean, hats off to the likes of Ada Lovelace, and that has really done some excellent work in this area. I've taken part in their Citizens Biometrics Council as well, and I think looking at that wider stakeholder involvement to increase transparency of how organisations are bringing technology to market is really important, which is also something that Biometrics Institute is championing with their ethical principle framework, and encouraging companies all the way through from the R&D to roll out to be much more transparent about how they're doing things. We held an event recently looking at how to set up an external or internal ethics board, and looking at who might be the types of individuals and the different skill sets that might fit. So we have people from the human rights side, consumer rights, last mile tech, accessibility and online harms that are formed the Guardians Council that meet quarterly with the terms of reference and minutes published. And we find that is really useful in terms of inviting that scrutiny to regularly look under the covers. They read all of our weekly internal sort of summaries of what we're doing and how we're going about things, and can question and query things. And we've set up internally an internal ethics group that prepares different topics, and where staff can flag things and say, what should we think about that? And it could be, a very tiny country in the world has asked for a government use of Yoti in the same way that we do so for the states of Jersey, or it could be something radically different, like how are we increasing retention of a broader range of staff, or accessibility. So a whole range of different issues. But I think looking at ways that identity companies in particular can show transparently how they're operating and some of the decisions and thought processes and tricky things they're going through. So a few months ago, we did quite a bit of work and invited lots of input in terms of a health credentials white paper, but lots of other people have taken that forward and built on it. And I think looking at the different sectors that we're working in, it is so broad that you need across all of them to consistently look at that ethical lens. Looking at both the inclusion element, looking at the redress, and looking at the different markets that you're acting in. So be that on the age front, looking at the whys and, for example, age as an element to prevent grooming. And there's many different methods around both parental consent, but age checking, be that behavioural or be that other markers. We've also been looking at recruitment and how this can help in the journey for recruitment screening. And again, these are areas where without government intervention, there will not be that marketplace where this can play a role. But likewise, you need the granularity of thinking and evidence that this is inclusive and it has been done with the right ethical oversight. Companies House is another classic one in the UK, where for a long time there's been discussion about how digital identity could play a key role, knowing who's setting up a business, or if they're nominating Sue Daley to be a director. At the moment, you would not know if I set up a company and traded on your good name. So looking at those different parts of the UK economy and some of the short-term measures that have come in during COVID, we still need to fight that those are retained at the end, because at the moment that isn't a foregone conclusion. The right to work checks using different forms of digital checking at the moment is not something that at the moment is guaranteed to continue. We've had large amounts of abuse to retail staff over the past period, 905 incidents of verbal, physical and racial abuse in 1 week by one store. And business leaders are asking, how can I use different forms of AI or age checking to deter that and let the tech take the strain? The furlough payment was a wonderful example that was brought in by Bryn. If other players sat around the table had been able to support that, could we have reduced that 3.5 billion hole that was lost? So the time is really ripe, but unless legislation is changed, a wider set of players cannot support this. And yes, I agree wholeheartedly that at the same time, we do need to not always just say this is the right answer, but ensure that the oversight is put in alongside.
Absolutely. It does then feel to me that we've got a hell of a lot to discuss going forward, and we've only just scratched the surface today, but we've only got a few minutes left and it's gone so quickly. And I found this absolutely fascinating. There is so much potential here, but also so much to get right and work together on going forward. And I think this conversation itself just shows the importance of all these, of academia, of private sector, of government policymakers coming together and exploring these issues and really working together on what is a real opportunity for the UK if we get this right. Now we're coming to the end, so thank you for all your questions on the Q&A. Apologies if we didn't get to all of them. And as promised, I had a final question I wanted to just ask all the panelists to sum up, which they've had a bit of time to think about. You've got probably about a minute each, apologies. But really, thank you for all your input and all your thoughts today. Really, really important discussion. But just rounding up with what is the one, I will allow two if you can be quick, steps or key issues, or what do you want to see happen next in terms of moving this debate and conversation forward in the UK? And Bryn, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, so I would just start by addressing Michael's last comment, which is that a digital identity infrastructure allows me to be anonymous. It allows me to be pseudonymous. It also allows me to assert my traditional identity attributes of name, address, date of birth, but it's also much richer than that. It's my education, it's my experiences, it's my qualifications, it's my social life. A digital identity infrastructure needs to touch on all of that. And in terms of what I would like for people to take forward from this, is that I do think that we are at a potential inflection point, but what we need to do less of is talking about this, and we actually need bold leadership to actually implement a proper digital identity infrastructure that supports all of those use cases for the benefit of the individual and for the efficiency of the economy and broader society.
Great, bold leadership. Thank you, Bryn. Edgar, over to you, and then I'll come to Michael, and then we'll finish on Julie.
Okay, two very quick ones. So during the Labour ID cards proposals, I remember Dave Birch saying it would be really great if we could get ID cards into a soap opera storyline. If you're watching Corrie and EastEnders at the moment, they are all with their masks and their social distancing, etc., etc. So there's a fantastic opportunity to put something there and to have the discussions going into the wider public. I think a really important next step is, and this has come up in some of the questions, has been around Windrush, hostile environments, using either the lack of evidence around identification or forcing undue requirements to prove yourself for things that don't actually need it as being a really, really important thing. That's one part of a digital identity system. You can do lots of things without necessarily having all of that, but I think that's one that we do need to be very, very careful about not losing sight of. This issue of who might be unintentionally excluded from all of the potential benefits that we're getting for those situations where you actually need to know who the person is.
Great, Edgar, thank you. Michael.
I'd say that I think the future of many technologies, including digital identity, is going to be intertwined with edge computing and physical devices that people have. And if we don't focus on opening these up, we're going to get huge centralized power as a result, and we're going to get no market, and you're going to get no ability for UK companies to have any say in the matter or influence any standards whatsoever. So start with thinking about the whole stack from software to hardware, consider interoperability and opening up those niches using law if necessary.
Thank you, Michael. Really clear. Thank you. And the last word to Julie before we have to wrap up.
Thank you, Sue. So I would really like to be a fly on the wall in that digital identity strategy board, and put two words up on the whiteboard: transparency and ethics. We all need to understand who is on that board, what is their terms of reference, and what is their timeline for legislative change over this next period. And we need to see that within that, on the ethics front, redress and accessibility is there, with a public education campaign or a public education future outlined, because we cannot go around having over the next year headlines in key broadsheets in the UK where it's really not helpful for the public and it's not portraying what actually is happening. And if government has joined up, the different departments are joined up, that should be something that is clear to the press, clear to citizens and business. That will instill confidence and hopefully the innovation that we all want to see.
Julie, thank you so much. Well, look, unfortunately, that's it. We've run out of time, which has just been a fascinating conversation. So thank you so much to all our panelists, to Bryn, to Edgar, to Julie, to Michael, for being so open and being so passionate about the opportunity, but also how we get this right, not just right for our economy, right for our society, but right for every single person in the UK as this technology moves forward. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you so much to all our panelists, and obviously please thank them in the virtual way. And then I hand back over, I think, to Olivier to round up the session. But on behalf of myself, thank you, everybody, for a wonderful panel. Thank you.